Hi, I'm Meta Spencer.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to meet you. You're Adam Horowitz, right? And you're
Yes,
in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
I
And
am.
what a marvelous background. You're an artist, apparently. Mm,
I'm an artist, and my partner is an artist, and we have a art house. And I built the house,
really?
and my partner is the painter who made the paintings on behind me. So I make films mostly, and she makes paintings and sculptures and things.
I should have called you years ago. There were no other courses on nuclear weapons. And I felt that every undergraduate should have an opportunity to learn about nuclear weapons. So I used to teach for about 5 years, I think. I taught one course a year. And one of the things that I would do, at least two of the years, maybe more, I used your film, Nuclear Savage. And it used to make it's the only time I've ever wept in my class was
Oh,
watching your film.
yes.
You brought tears to my eyes. It was such an amazing, horrible thing to find out about my country because I'm a dual citizen. I'm American living in Canada and have been a Canadian citizen for 40 some years. So I clearly have dual loyalties and I don't know, it's hard to call it loyalty toward a country that would do a thing like that.
Mhm.
Basically, I think what you exposed in that film was I think you made the case very clear that the United States deliberately exposed the Marshall Islanders, at least on one occasion, to radiation that was clearly intended to make them guinea pigs, experimental subjects, just to see how sick they'd get or what would happen if they got
Mhm.
exposed. That's what you showed, right?
That is what I showed. And what I also showed was that not only were Marshall Islanders exposed on the initial occasion in March 1st, 1954, so it's just the anniversary was just 2 weeks ago, but they were taken away 2 days later. They were left in the fallout for 2 days from this giant hydrogen bomb, and they got sick and their hair fell out and they were burned and they were violently ill. And they were left in that state for 2 days and then evacuated to another island. But they were only evacuated for 3 years. And then 3 years later, the US scientists said, well, we now have a chance for another experiment, which is to see what happens when you live in a contaminated environment. And the initial exposure was showed what happens when you're in the direct immediate fallout uh, immediately after a hydrogen bomb blast. But in 1956, the scientists came up with this plan to study what happens to people living in a contaminated environment long term. And they planned that at Los Alamos Laboratory, which is very near Santa Fe, where I live. And it's only 25 miles from where I live, is Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. And they made this plan to repatriate all the people back to their island, which they knew was highly contaminated. They brought them back in 1957, the entire population, and of several hundred at that time. And they left them there and studied them regularly for the next 30 years. So, in fact, they deliberately exposed them, you could say, for 30 years and lied to them and kept telling them that it was safe and that there was no contamination when they knew full well that it was contaminated. And not only did they know full well, they took scientific readings regularly and they studied the people every year. And they sent even a Department of Energy medical research ship to the island at least once a year and sometimes more to take blood tests and radiation readings and physical exams and really studied them like guinea pigs for 30 years. And even after 30 years, when there were lots of cases of birth defects and lots of cancer and horrendous birth defects, the people kept saying, we don't think it's safe here. And the US refused to take them off again and left them there. And it wasn't until 1985 that Greenpeace stepped in and said, okay, we'll evacuate you. And Greenpeace sent their ship, Rainbow Warrior, and evacuated the population in 1985. And that's the only reason they left, is because Greenpeace went and took them en masse, and they took apart even their houses, and they took everything from the island and moved to another island that wasn't contaminated. So it was
That is
a
just
30-year experiment.
most ghastly thing. And you found part of your film focused on this wonderful man who was, I think, for a while, the prime minister of the Marshallese or something. And he did the research in Washington, right?
Yes.
And he was going through the files, and he found, I think you showed a photo of a document showing that originally that somebody had been planning to do this kind of experimentation on mice, was it? And they had changed, they changed, sort of like crossed out the word mice and put in people, or I'm exaggerating,
Yes,
but it was something
it's
like
not literal.
literally.
They originally planned these experiments in 1953, and they planned for this particular hydrogen bomb test to study the effects on animals. And then they just, at some point, we don't know the precise moment, they crossed out mice and said, no, let's study human beings. And it's like science fiction, but they did this, and they did this at Los Alamos, are the scientists who came up with this. But, the thing to understand too is that they did also study animals and the effects on animals. And they did this not only in the Marshall Islands, but they did this in Nevada, at the Nevada test site. And they did it extensively over the years. The first test in Nevada, I think, was in maybe 1950, atmospheric nuclear test.
Mhm.
And they studied mice, cats, dogs, monkeys, pigs, cows, sheep,
Okay.
any kind of animal you can think of that they can put in a cage. They blasted them and radiated them, and I collected documents also that were also called 4.1 that were part of that experiment, that also included animals, and that were also done at Nevada test site.
Mhm.
And so the Marshall Islanders were just one of the species of test creatures that they used. And I can tell you also that the cruelty that was shown to these animals it's beyond the pale. And
Really?
I found photographs of Project 4.1 test subjects that were dogs at Nevada test site that were done, I believe, later that year. And they used Dalmatians and um, just these poor animals that were burned to death, and also burned almost to death and then died in agony. And the cruelty and just the ruthless nature of these experiments is it's like Dr. Mengele at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And the original one, not the original, but before I named my film Nuclear Savage, when you're working on a film, it takes a long time to make these films, and you're always wondering what title to use for a film, which has a lot of reasons why you come up with certain titles. And the original working title of the film was called Proving Grounds, because they called the Marshall Islands the Pacific Proving Grounds. And I liked that name because the story is also about the islanders trying to establish proving grounds in court, or in the court of public opinion. They were proving grounds that they were deliberately exposed, but it wasn't kind of strong enough. So, but then I, for a while, thought, oh, I know what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it American Mengele. And
That would be a good title, but
yeah,
certainly the nuclear savage was, it had this little twist, you know. They
yeah,
refer to they bring these people, young men, I remember, to Washington or someplace, sort of dress them up in street clothes and make them,
yes,
but this is all just for them to do some tests, and they dismiss their suffering, because after all, they're just savages.
mm,
They're nuclear savages. Oh, but you know, in a way, even the American population, they weren't testing us or measuring, you know, what happened to us, but we were all experimental subjects in the broadest sense of the word. I remember in 1960 going out in front of my parents' house in San Bernardino, California, early in the morning to watch the blast. It was an interesting thing. It would be, I guess, I don't know, close to where you are. I don't know, but or White Sands, New Mexico, wasn't it?
White Sands, New Mexico. They did the first ever atomic bomb test. And then they switched from New Mexico to Nevada, just north of Las Vegas,
Oh, so
which you would have been able to see
we did.
from Southern California, from San Bernardino. You would have been able to see the explosion, or the light from the explosion, because it was near Las Vegas.
So I took my 6-month-old son out there with me to the yard, exposed him, I guess you could say. The wind was blowing in the other direction, didn't come toward us. How did I know? I mean, my parents, you know, this was sort of like an interesting thing. If the circus had come to town, you'd go look at it. It wasn't a guilt thing. It was like, this is just part of our military work. And so, but the wind was blowing in the other direction and killed a bunch of sheep, and then began poisoning other babies. You know, when I remember, even here in Canada, there was a project to collect baby teeth to find that they had strontium 90 in them. All the babies had strontium 90 in the teeth because it was falling out of the clouds onto the mother's milk. Okay, and
Well,
then when I went to Berkeley, or actually it would have been a little earlier than that, because it was where it was my husband, um, who had been in the Navy in the 40s, 48 or something like that, and he was on a ship that went to Eniwetok. I remember,
wow.
I didn't know what Eniwetok was, but I remember his talking about having, that was his role, to go to Eniwetok. So looks like, you know, everybody was getting exposed, but not the way you would treat laboratory animals.
Mm.
They just didn't care about whether we were all going to be harmed by this. You know, I would have to say your film really is the most damning evidence can imagine. And I'm surprised that nobody has, or maybe they have tried to take it up as a war crime, that this is the harm done with this kind of experimentation and the deliberateness of
Mm.
the thing.
Well, Meta, this testing that was done in Nevada that you witnessed firsthand actually exposed hundreds of thousands of Americans to radiation in the 50s.
Mhm.
And at Nevada test site, they did eventually over 1,000 nuclear tests. 900 something were done underground, and many of those vented radiation into the atmosphere. But over 100 of the tests done in Nevada were atmospheric tests. And all of that radiation, all of that fallout blew across the United States. And the prevailing winds for most of those tests was from the West, which is why you in Southern California probably were not exposed much, because most of the radiation drifted to the east,
Mhm.
but it completely contaminated communities nearby Nevada test site, including especially the town of St. George, Utah, was nuked many times and people there exposed many times. But these clouds of radiation went all the way to the East Coast.
Mhm.
And in fact, there was one test in the late 50s, and at the Kodak film factory in Rochester, New York, one day, all of the film was ruined in their factory.
Oh boy.
In Rochester, New York, and the Kodak authority, Kodak executives called up the government and said, all of our film is ruined. And that's a lot of film. This is the Kodak main factory. And did you guys have a test or something? And the US government officials said, yeah, we had a test 2 days ago in Nevada. It was a little bigger than we expected. And there was enough radiation to destroy all of the film at Kodak in upstate New York, which is 2,000 miles away. And that means that the amount of radiation released was significant and crossed the entire country. And that happened maybe 100 times, 100 atmospheric tests. And the other thing is that at many of those tests, beginning in the early 50s, the Army sent US troops to the test site and they put them in trenches, like World War I style trenches within a mile or 2 miles of ground zero for these tests.
Mhm.
And they deliberately exposed soldiers to these atomic tests at very close distance because they wanted to know how soldiers would react in the atomic battlefield of the future. And in the end, they exposed at close range 250,000 American servicemen to radiation.
Mhm.
And over the years since those tests, thousands and thousands of them developed cancer and died or became very sick. And there's still some handfuls of them alive today who are still fighting for healthcare and pension and compensation for being atomic guinea pigs. And the US government, over the years, they've given out some compensation to some of them, but the US government position has mostly been, well, prove it. Prove you were there and prove you were exposed.
Yeah.
Well, these soldiers, when they were taken to these tests, were sworn to secrecy under penalty of treason. And they were told, this is for the security of the United States. You are US soldiers, so you do what you're told. And if you talk about it, you'll be charged with treason.
Mhm.
So most of them never talked about it because they swore an oath of secrecy. And then they died horrible deaths in secrecy. And it was only in the 1990s that they started coming out saying, we swore secrecy, but all of our colleagues are dead and we have cancer and this needs to come out. And then in the late 90s, the Congress did provide some compensation to some of them, but mostly they denied it because they had no proof of how much radiation they got and how much exposure they got. And when somebody gets cancer, you cannot prove that this bomb test was the source of your cancer 20 or 30 years later. And they did the same thing in the Marshall Islands to those people. And they said, well, you can't prove that all these birth defects and all this cancer is from the bomb testing. You can't prove it. Therefore, it's just a statistical glitch. And their also favorite excuse was, and not only that, but the number of people on these islands that were exposed is what they call to social scientists statistically insignificant, meaning there aren't enough of you in this study to prove, and it's therefore statistically insignificant to try to establish proof. And
Well, wait a
and then
minute.
the other,
What's the population of the Marshallese?
well, you know, at that time in the 50s, it was in 20,000 or something. And today in the islands, it's a little over 50,000, I believe. And then there's another 20,000 who live in the United States. But the US scientists established that the fallout had hit almost all of the Marshall Islands, of which there are hundreds of islands that are populated. But in terms of determining the precise health effects on the population, it's not possible. Just as in the United States, from these 100 atmospheric tests in Nevada, it's not possible to determine how many people got cancer as a result of these tests. And it's really just something that can only be guessed at. But it is well known that of those 250,000 servicemen, the cancer rates and death rates, that it's obvious that they were a result of these nuclear tests. But again, the exact cause and the precise numbers can never be known.
Well, I did a talk show, I don't know, around a year ago with a woman named Tricia Pritikin, who's a Berkeley lawyer. And she was a baby in, her father worked at Hanford, the place where they made the plutonium pits. And they didn't tell anybody that there was a health risk involved. But she's been sick with various things, definite effects of this all her life. Her father, and I think she said her father, her mother, and her infant brother, newborn baby brother, all died of the effects. And whether they can prove it, that's another matter. But as a lawyer, she went about the business of trying to find other people who also had not known, as she did not know, that she had been exposed deliberately to terrible things, radiation effects. And she made a court case. She collected a few thousand people, I believe. And she has a book called The Plaintiffs, I believe, which came out 6 months or so ago, about this case in which she was trying to prove that the people in the neighborhood around Hanford, especially those whose families had been working there, that everybody was exposed to the radiation effects. So it's worldwide. It's in Russia. You know, there's a wonderful woman named Nadezhda Kutepova, who was born in Mayak in, is that Kazakhstan? No, it's
where they had a terrible accident.
yes, they did. And it's not Kazakhstan, it's can't remember the name of the city, near a certain city, well-known city in Russia. But that is where they did most of their nuclear production of bombs and so on, but reprocessing and even all kinds of experimentation.
And they contaminated the entire area.
That's right. Thousands of people were
Well, I'll
exposed.
tell you, they did the most of the atmospheric bomb testing in Kazakhstan. And
Yes.
Mayak was, I believe, a production area where they manufactured plutonium and radioactive bomb parts. But in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan was like the Marshall Islands or the Nevada test site of the Soviet Union. And they exploded giant nuclear weapons there, and they exposed thousands of people there, including indigenous people of that area, tribal people of Kazakhstan. And the same thing happened in French nuclear testing, where they did it in Mururoa near Tahiti, and they also blew up giant atmospheric hydrogen bombs and exposed Polynesian people to radioactive bomb tests near Tahiti. And the French also did nuclear testing in the Sahara Desert. And they exposed indigenous Tuareg nomad people to radiation in the Sahara Desert. And these Tuareg nomads on camels who lived in tents and were nomads were also heavily exposed. And the British government had their own exposure of their own servicemen and also indigenous people in Australia. And the British did nuclear testing in the desert of Australia, and the fallout exposed the Aboriginal people of Australia to
nuclear savages, all of them, right?
All of them. And the British also did it in the South Pacific at a place called Christmas Island. And at Christmas Island, the British blew up their own hydrogen bombs in the South Pacific as well. So the United States is one of the top 5 nuclear powers that did these atmospheric tests and exposed unknowing civilians and especially indigenous people to this poison.
I don't think anything like the amount of publicity has ever been given to these tragedies. And I wonder, will it take our great-grandchildren to bring a case to the International Court of Justice accusing these nuclear countries of genocide or of war crimes to have done the terrible things that they did?
Well, the United States is not a signatory to the International Court of Justice.
That's true.
So after Bush and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney invaded Iraq on false pretenses and essentially destroyed Iraq and set up this destruction of that entire region that continues today, there were calls for war crimes trials for Bush for invading Iraq. But since the US does not participate in the International Court of Justice, those charges don't stick. And, you know, I think the whole time I've been going to the Marshall Islands and covering that story, I also think about Vietnam and Cambodia and the invasion of Iraq, and I should say the second invasion of Iraq, as war crimes that were committed by the United States. And, you know, I've been to Vietnam and I've been to Cambodia, and I grew up watching Vietnam on television, and I am thankful I wasn't sent there. But the United States military killed 3 million Vietnamese during that war, and US bombing killed 1 million Cambodians at that time. And, there's been no calling to task for what we did in Vietnam. And by the way, Meta, I want to let you know, I also went to Berkeley. So you and I are both Berkeley alumni, which has probably helped form us to address these kinds of injustices.
I'm sure that my formation was mostly in Berkeley.
Yes, mine too.
Although we're a different generation. I came here in 1971 to Canada, and I was in Berkeley during the free speech movement. And
wow, Mario Savio.
yeah, right.
Well, I went to Berkeley. I didn't go to Berkeley until 1975. And at that time, I was at first a little disappointed that I had missed the 60s and the free speech movement and all the anti-war protests in Berkeley. And I got there, I thought kind of too late, but it was funny because the first time I went there was right at the time when Patty Hearst was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. And I lived right near where she was kidnapped. And I thought, wow, well, maybe the 60s are still alive. And then not only did they kidnap her, but she joined them. And I thought, oh, well, maybe there is some sense of change or radical change that's still in the air. But I think you were very fortunate to be there.
I was there 20 years, over 20 years.
Oh.
So I,
wow.
I saw the really exciting
Wonderful.
parts. But there was a moment, I think when you were there, it was fairly conservative.
It became extremely conservative. And in the time I was in school there, I saw the rise of the right. And by the time I left, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And that was, I believe, in 1980. And when I left and Ronald Reagan was elected president, I said, wow, when I got here, Patty Hearst was kidnapped and joined the SLA. And then when I left, Ronald Reagan was president. And I said, wow, I really saw a sea change in the political consciousness of this country. And I ended up having to stay an extra year to get my degree. And then I just took journalism for the last year so I could get enough credits to get a degree in that. And
was my friend Adam Hochschild teaching in the journalism department by the time you were there? I think he certainly has been around several years.
He was not there when I was there, but he did that book about the Congo and King Leopold, right? King Leopold's ghosts, right?
Yeah.
You know,
he and Arlie are very dear friends. I've known them since, I don't know, the 60s, early 60s.
Well, I know his work. Look at what happened in the Congo under King Leopold, the genocide and slavery and theft that was just outrageous in modern history. And
I want you to tell me more about the Marshallese, because you are uniquely positioned to report on them. I don't know many people who do. Tell me also about this. What's the name of this dome?
It's called the Runit Dome, RUNIT, and it is located at Eniwetok Atoll, where your husband went in the Navy. Did he witness a nuclear test there, by the way?
I don't know. Probably. I honestly have no idea. He never
He didn't talk about it. He was
But
probably sworn to
it
secrecy.
wasn't like that he would, I don't think it was a secret. I just think it was not a big drama in those days. This is just part of the military.
Part of the military.
Although he was off and on a conscientious objector, but he wasn't very conscientious. And I would say we did the marriage did not last, but I caught my pacifism from the family, more from his parents than from him.
Oh.
Put it that way. But at any rate, since then, it's only late in the last few years that I've heard about the Runit Dome, which is worrisome to me, not just for the sake of my concern about Marshallese, but because it could, something terrible could happen that would take the radiation in, I believe, in the direction of China.
Well, the Runit Dome is contains radioactive debris from testing, and it's a giant concrete dome. They took an atom bomb crater and they filled it up with radioactive debris. And by debris, and Eniwetok was a base for this testing, and they had all kinds of buildings and equipment and bulldozers and huts and Quonset huts, and it was all highly radioactive. And then beginning, I think in the 70s, I'm pretty sure is when they started that, they decided to try to make an effort to clean up some of this stuff. And they collected all of this debris from radioactive debris from their testing and filled up this atom bomb crater
So
with
it
debris.
wasn't collected until the 70s.
That's my understanding. And I think that dome, yeah, I think it was not built until the 70s, and they put a concrete cap over this pile of radioactive debris, and they have since washed their hands of it and walked away and said, well, now it's yours, we're done. And this concrete cap now is degraded and cracked, and all the radioactive elements in there are leaking, and they're leaking into the air and into the sea. But, you know, the strange thing about the Runit Dome and even the testing in the Marshall Islands itself, by itself is horrendous and contaminating the environment and people. But this has gone on and still goes on in so many places, in so many ways. And if you look at Fukushima and the amount of radiation that has been released from those molten reactor cores in Fukushima, and they are have collected since over the years since the meltdowns at Fukushima, millions of gallons of highly, highly radioactive water that they pump out of the ground. And they've been building tanks and tanks and tanks. And these tanks each of them hold like 1,000 Olympic swimming pools. And they've built hundreds of these tanks, and they can't build the tanks fast enough. And they recently said, well, we don't know what to do with all this highly radioactive water because the groundwater is contaminated and keeps getting contaminated. They're just dumping it in the sea now.
I've heard that they were going to. Have they begun to do that?
They've been doing that all along.
Really?
And the Japanese press is highly controlled by the Japanese government, to the point where if somebody reports on something that is deemed a national security secret, they can be thrown in jail. So Japanese journalists are afraid to report on this because they can be sent to prison. So it's not covered, it's not reported, but they have released probably millions and millions of gallons of highly radioactive water into the sea over the years, and keep doing it. And you can be sure that when they do these releases, they don't call the press and say, oh, you better report on this. We're releasing another 1,000,000 gallons of totally contaminated water into the sea. And it's an environmental catastrophe and a scandal of global proportions that's going on as we speak, that nobody can do anything about because it's Japanese territory, it's Japanese sovereign state. It's against the law for Japanese journalists to even cover it, and they just do what they want.
Right.
And that radiation spreads all around the area and around the entire Pacific. So I don't want to minimize the Runit Dome and we talk, but if we really want to concern ourselves with this type of radioactive contamination going on, Fukushima it's going on now, and it's a catastrophe. And I'm not sure what we should do about it because the Japanese government will not permit observation or monitoring to any extent. We're.
Well, I have only a little thing to add to that, and that is that a couple of weeks or maybe a month ago, I interviewed a guy named Kulaki, who is with the Union of Concerned Scientists, posted in Tokyo. And I wanted to have a conversation about the decision. Apparently, his report really was that the government of Japan is doing various things to try to make sure that Biden doesn't declare no first use of nuclear weapons, or they don't call it that anymore. They call it something like a sole purpose. The sole purpose of nuclear weapons is deterrence. It would never be to use them. And Biden himself, before becoming president, favored that. And so there are people within his government who would like to see that position adopted for the first time by the US. And it's the Japanese and the other countries, perhaps, but it's certainly the Japanese who are so-called under the nuclear umbrella, and therefore they do not want that to happen. They believe that they are protected from God knows what, China or who, by this nuclear, what do they call it? Extended deterrence, I think they call it, where other countries are supposedly defended by this nuclear threat. So they're trying to keep the government, the US government, from taking what we would certainly consider a favorable step.
That the United States is in the middle of a program to rebuild its nuclear arsenal from scratch.
Modernization.
And they call it they used to call it the RWRP, the Reliable Warhead Replacement Program. And since they cannot, according to international treaty, conduct underground testing anymore, they can't test any of the nuclear weapons in the stockpile, of which there are, I believe, 9,000 or something like that right now. And the scientists say, well, these nuclear weapons we have are all really old and they're stale.
Yeah.
And we do not know if they will work.
Wouldn't that be terrible if they didn't work?
Yes. So since we cannot test them, we have to build new ones to make sure that they're reliable. And we know we can build new ones from scratch that are reliable, but we don't know if all these 9,000 or 10,000 that we have in the arsenal are really dependable. So they have embarked on a program to build new ones.
But actually, even that, I'm sorry, but that explanation really doesn't hold up, because they're making much better ones. You know, it's not just like replacing them; they're making snazzy ones, really,
and miniature.
Yeah,
that's the new the new trend is they call them strategic nuclear weapons, and they're suitcase size,
Mhm.
and or something like that. And
Tactical.
they're tactical
It's
for
tactical.
battlefield use. Yes,
Tactical weapons. These are the small ones, and there are a bunch of them still left in Europe. They
yes.
haven't taken them out yet. And I just hope one of these European countries says, come and get your stuff. We don't want them anymore. Thank you. I forgot to add one thing about Japan. And that is that my dear friend, Doug Saunders, who's really the best journalist in Canada, and he writes for the Globe and Mail, but he wrote a column the other day saying we took the worst message from Fukushima because nobody has died of it, and they can't prove that there's any cancer connection. Well, I haven't done the research again that I need to do to go confront him, but he and I will be having a conversation about this one of these days because you may know there's a woman who runs a podcast called Nuclear Hot Seat.
Mm.
And Libby Halevi is her name, and I think she's in LA. And she has like a radio program, only it's podcasts. And she interviews people every week about nuclear matters. And I'm pretty sure I heard people on one of her shows talking about the increase in cancer rates, which I don't know. I can't quote things that I haven't actually looked up, but I'm going to look it up because I do think I did see that some of these people were reporting on increased cancer rates around Fukushima. And of course, they were planning to run the Olympics right through there.
Right.
So, and
Well, the hottest elements, hottest meaning most radioactive elements, uh, have decayed to an extent now that the background radiation on the land around there is decreased a lot since the accident. But I think the bigger question is, what have they released into the sea? And what do they continue to release in the sea? And what are they planning to release into the sea? And I think that the death rates and cancer rates on land in that area, since they evacuated the vicinity of the power plant right away, and there's still an exclusion zone where nobody can live, they, I think, did a fairly good job of keeping the death rates and the cancer rates down on land in that vicinity by establishing this exclusion zone like they did in Chernobyl. But the question of what are they releasing and have they released into the ocean? And all the reports that we have already seen indicate enormous release of radiation into the sea, which then, of course, is the Pacific Ocean, and it gets diluted and spread all over the Pacific Ocean in a way that is very difficult to assess or measure. And it just, this poisoning of the sea that is disgusting and unacceptable, and yet goes on. And I think that the death toll on land around Fukushima, in a way, is kind of a distraction from the bigger picture of how much radiation are they still releasing every day from that place into the sea. And I think that is a question we really need to address, all of us, as human beings responsible for this technology.
Okay, let's take that seriously. If it's up to you and me to expose that and to get somebody to investigate and to do something about it, how the hell shall we go about it? I mean, I always think in practical terms. How can I make a difference? And if you've, as you've described it, the Japanese government have made it impossible for Japanese journalists to do that.
yes.
Who else could do that? And who is maybe trying to do that. Do I don't trust the IAEA
No.
to, because they have a vested interest in promoting nuclear peaceful uses of nuclear power,
Right.
and so the WHO is compromised. The WHO cannot do the kind of research that we would want to have them do into the health effects of exposure to radiation, because they have some sort of undisclosed but verifiable
Hmm.
commitment or deal with the IAEA.
Mhm.
And as Kate Brown has written about the health effects of Chernobyl, and not just in the local area, but into Belarus and other countries. And she's got all kinds of very interesting material in her most recent book. Um, and clearly there are major dangers still remaining from Chernobyl.
Mm.
And so, but it's also the case that the WHO reports are not reliable and cannot be trusted. They definitely are not, did not address all the evidence. And she talks
No,
about how that is the case.
the UN, is like any huge bureaucracy, and the UN is its own bureaucratic government of sorts. Uh, the problem with the UN is they do not have authority, just as was proven when the US wanted to invade Iraq under George W. Bush for supposedly having weapons of mass destruction. And the UN voted, no, you can't invade Iraq. And the US did it anyway. And that was I think, a very prime example of the lack of authority that the UN has, especially with powerful nations. Um, and I don't think, I think the UN needs to exist, and it's very important and needs to be used to the extent that it can be in any matters of peace and environment and all of these things, but they don't have teeth. It's going to take journalists from various countries, including Japan, who go the extra mile and take the extra steps to take the risk to report this. It's going to take some officials of the TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, to step forward, and even if they don't give their identity, to report what they know. And outside journalists, outside of Japan, to keep this story under the spotlight. And I would suggest also academia, that it's students and academics can perhaps do their part, or do a part in exposing this and finding out what's happening, and as keeping international interest on this through academic initiatives and classes and lectures and teaching. And so, yeah, I would say what we can do is journalists and academics it's up to us. Los Alamos is now a bomb production facility. And
Oh,
Los Alamos used to just be research and development of nuclear weapons,
uh-huh.
and was research and development up until just a couple of years ago. And now they have been designated as a nuclear bomb production facility. And they are in the process of building a factory there to build plutonium pits, which is the core of a nuclear weapon. and they are manufacturing these at Los Alamos, and they're slated to build 30 new bomb pits per year at this new multi-billion-dollar facility. And the other site is Savannah River, Georgia, where they're going to build another 50 pits per year. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of this nuclear bomb posture, and Japan saying the United States should not commit to not using them first, or whatever the language is, they're building them 25 miles from where I'm sitting right now.
It seems to be good things going along with bad things. I mean, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but there's nobody in the US who ever heard of it. The US and the other nuclear powers are, of course, not in favor of it, nor has Canada joined it, and a lot of other countries that are trying to be friendly continue cozying up to the US. So we have our work cut out for us. And my friend, I am so delighted to meet you, because you're not just a good Berkeley alumnus, but an ally in this very, very important struggle. And I really have enjoyed this conversation, although I've almost cried a couple of times as I've heard you talking about, especially the war crimes, I call it.
Yes, it's war crimes, and trying to figure out what do we do personally. And, there's sadly only so much we can do as individuals.
But, would you like to be the kind of person who spent your life lying on the beach, looking at the clouds? I mean, I find I'm very grateful for having had a number of years of trying to come to terms with a really tough problem. And, I value having problems. I think every life, to be meaningful, has to be a struggle against solving,
Did you go to Berkeley?
I sure did. And I got that
That's
from
how they talk in Berkeley.
I got that philosophy from Karl Popper in his class in Berkeley. And I do believe that, I'm grateful for having found a really juicy problem to work on. And I tell you, there's nothing more daunting and challenging and worth devoting one's life to than working to try to overcome these nuclear weapons.
And we have these examples like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa, and there's so many people who, as individuals, demonstrated that as individuals, you can actually do things and you can actually motivate change. And those people stay in my mind a lot. Very quick, I guess we need to wrap this up, but I just wanted to mention my current film project now is about Japanese war crimes in World War II and the comfort women who were sex slaves of the Japanese military during World War II. And
when you get that film finished, let's get back in touch and we'll have a conversation about that. Okay.
Absolutely. And, bless you. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
And your devotion and your conversations, and bless you. Thank you.
And the admiration is mutual.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.